Lord Byron, mad, bad and dangerous to know, notorious romantic hero and rock star poet, a genius obsessed by image, sexually irresistible to both men and women. His scandals shocked the nation. Byron was a 19th century superstar, fated to live fast and die young. On the 14th of May 1824, a month after Lord Byron's death, his closest friends gathered to read through his personal memoirs. After days of intense discussion, they reached a unanimous decision. Byron's memoirs could not be published and should go with him to the grave.
I think the reason why Byron has become such a kind of mythic figure is the fact that his memoirs were burned, and it was said they would damn Lord B to everlasting infamy if published. So it's incredibly intriguing what could be in them, but it's meant that a whole legend can spring up around Byron because we don't have these kind of solid facts.
Byron is complex because he has his foot in most possible camps. He is male, strongly male, lives in a world of male friendships. Part of his personality is female, he's bisexual. He is a skeptic, he is religious, he believes passionately against war, dies as a soldier. He's extremely English but was born a Scot and makes himself into a European. You can keep going indefinitely in that kind of way.
In the early 19th century, Byron had gained international celebrity and notoriety through his romantic poetry.
Byron's a sort of celebrity in our modern sense of the word. He's a bit like a pop star. He's a bit like a famous actor.
And I think in many ways Byron was the original on-screen rebel. He's the grandfather of figures like James Dean in the 50s and rock and roll stars like Jim Morrison, who are tortured poets who live fast and die young. The way that women wrote about reading Byron was extremely sexualized in many ways. The famous courtesan Harriet Wilson wrote that she took Don Juan to bed with her and that it kept her up all night. And this kind of idea that it was like a lover that she slept with.
She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes.
Byron, probably more than any other figure in history or literature, was irresistible to all sexes. He was irresistible to women, to men, to friendship. I mean, he was a marvelous friend. He was a magnetic personality, a character of such charm and allure as to cast a spell, that there was a magical quality.
Byron's magnetic allure led him through a string of amorous liaisons, and he gained notoriety as a legendary sexual predator. His irresistible charms meant that no one was safe from his clutches.
Women were warned about looking him directly in the eye because they might be somehow mesmerized by him. Women would faint when he came into the room, famously. And certainly there was a lot of anxiety in the Christian and conservative press at the time that Byron would corrupt the young women of Britain.
Byron's poetry and behaviour were only part of his fascination.
His face was quite striking, and it was described as being like an alabaster vase lit up from within, which is glorious.
But Byron's beauty was flawed. He had been born with a club foot which made him incredibly self-conscious, and he was obsessed with how he was portrayed.
He would make artists change certain things about him. He always showed his neck and had quite sort of low, open-collared shirts. Very pale skin, dark hair, red lips, big, full, kind of curled lips. He clearly saw that his portrait was going to be an important reference for his readers and act kind of like a pin-up does today.
Byron was a sexual magnet, but beneath the glamorous exterior lurked a more complex character.
When Byron was writing, the idea of the poet was very different from the idea of the poet we have today. The poet in Byron's day was perceived as a kind of hero. In those days, poets really thought they could change society. We don't tend to think of poetry as having a huge social effect.
The view of poetry inherited, and which he was passionately attached to, was that poetry had something to do with moral life, and that you brought into some kind of relationship the passions, beauty, and something like goodness, how to live well. You don't associate that with Byron, but please do. Byron believed that.
People tend to think about Byron as a haughty figure. In fact, he's a man who cared passionately about suffering. He's a great champion of liberty, and he's perceived by many of his readers as this great radical figure.
He was a heroic figure, mainly because he was a campaigner for the underdog, and he always supported the underdog.
Whilst heroic and romantic, there was also a mad, bad and dangerous side to Byron. His exploits left behind scores of jilted lovers and 2 children, one of whom he abandoned as a baby and another of whom he sent away to a lonely death at the age of 4. His poetry and lifestyle was to send Byron on a roller coaster ride of sex, drink and debauchery. By the age of 20, Lord Byron was a celebrity and heartthrob, but his humble beginnings told a very different story.
Byron was born above a perfumer's shop in 1788, and his mother was abandoned at the time he was born because his father, who was known as Mad Jack Byron, had been disowned by his wastrel family. He had married purely for her inheritance. He made off with most of that and managed to get into debt for more, and thus had to go into exile.
Byron's ancestors on both sides were pretty colourful. His grandfather was an admiral known as Admiral Foulweather Jack Byron, and indeed he was shipwrecked many times and wrote an interesting narrative about his shipwreck, which includes his having to eat the paws of his pet spaniel, which had actually been buried for several weeks. Byron's mother's family were Scottish lairds coming from Aberdeenshire. They were very wild, extremely wild.
The Gordons of Guyte were an ancient Scottish clan, but where there was such an extraordinarily terrifying strain of madness that both his grandfather and a great-grandfather had committed suicide, as well as one of his mother's sisters.
His mother was vulgar, but came from an aristocratic family, the Gordons, the lower branch, but she always said it was the high branch, and she drove a kind of snobbery and intense pride of ancestry into Byron.
Although Byron's mother came from a privileged background, she and her son enjoyed none of the rich trappings associated with the aristocracy. Mad Jack had died in exile, and mother and son had moved to Aberdeen in near poverty.
He lived with his mother above another shop in Aberdeen, very deprived circumstances, barely able to afford the day school that he went to with much better off boys. The life of a very, we would say, lower middle class little boy with a single mother.
Their future looked bleak, but in 1798, their circumstances changed overnight when Byron's uncle on his father's side, the 5th Lord Byron, died and left him with lands and titles beyond his wildest dreams.
Byron was suddenly catapulted into being Lord Byron. When he first was taken by his mother to see Newstead, this great crumbling Gothic pile, he was overwhelmed and he wanted passionately to live in it. They couldn't live in it because it was falling in ruins, but this became one of the great ambitions of his life.
The influence of Newstead on Byron really can't be underestimated. You can imagine you're an 8-year-old boy and then being told you've inherited this extraordinary abbey with its great chapel and beautiful grounds, wonderful lakes, and even though crumbling, it's a kind of mirage. You see it rising up out of rather flat ground unexpectedly in this lovely soft local granite near Nottingham.
On the one hand, it's terrible. You're not moving into an aristocratic lifestyle with plenty of money behind it. On the other hand, it's fantastic. You're moving into this mysterious Gothic past, which moves him instantly, fixes his imagination.
Byron's life was transformed. He grew into a young gentleman, and although he did not live at Newstead full-time, it became the perfect backdrop for a hedonistic young lord.
It was the setting for a lot of extremely rowdy parties in which the local girls were brought in. There was a great deal of drinking, and he had got the skull of a monk, which was his own particular drinking vessel. But Newstead was a marvellous background for this kind of Gothic festival, in which they would dress up. Byron always fancied himself wearing monk's costume, partly because it kind of went rather well with the pallor of his face, I think, and partly because it was a kind of marvellous act of blasphemy.
It's the classic romantic abode in the sense that it's quite Gothic, and you can always picture the young Byron sort of brooding over various lost loves in this kind of this lovely Gothic backdrop.
In 1805, aged 17, after an aristocratic schooling, Byron's final rite of passage before becoming a true gentleman was to attend university.
He had hoped to go to Oxford and did not get in due to a spotty record, particularly in terms of behaviour, so went to Trinity College, where he hobnobbed again with the richest and most dissolute party-giving and attending young lords who spent more time in the local brothels. Very little time spent in studies, which was not even expected of young lords at Oxford, Cambridge at that period.
And he liked to spend, and he'd spent money that he didn't have. He used to write letters home asking for money for decanters, for booze, for more booze, for more decanters.
At Cambridge, Byron began to show his true hedonistic colours, but this was also matched by a new political idealism.
When he was not allowed to keep his dog Smut, wonderful name, in his rooms, he brought a pet bear.
Dancing bears were seen to be analogous to slaves, and if you freed a dancing bear, then that was a way of showing your solidarity with the anti-slavery movements.
Cambridge also allowed Byron to explore his burgeoning sexual desires.
It was also at Cambridge where he fell in love with a young chorister, John Edelston, and Byron's passion for this young man, a youth actually, a very beautiful boy with an exquisite voice, certainly was a very expensive passion in every sense. It haunted him because homosexuality was a capital offence.
Cambridge also had a subculture where they had shared signs and shared words. So they talked about Methodism, which was a secret reference to homosexuality. And Byron talked about his hyacinths, which were the young boys that he was attracted to. If Byron had been caught in homosexual act, it was more likely that he would have been hanged for it. And other homosexuals had actually hanged for the offence.
Byron was tortured by his homosexual desires, fearful of England's strict laws. After finishing at Cambridge, he decided to travel abroad to Europe, a tradition followed by many of his aristocratic contemporaries.
The reason for Byron's escape to Greece, and I think we need to look at it as an escape first of all, was perhaps because of his increasing desire to have more sexual expression and more sexual freedom.
Although he enjoyed the life of a sexual tourist, his travels to Greece had another, more powerful effect on Byron. The classical world of Greece and Rome was the core part of every young gentleman's schooling.
To be able to travel in a real mythological landscape was really important for Byron, to be able to go to those landmarks, those places which Homer talks about.
But Byron was also depressed by what he saw. The classical ruins inspired him, but highlighted the decline from Greece's ancient glory.
And that sort of mixture of ideal and kind of tawdry reality is something which marks his life, which marks his poetry, which is a kind of distinguishing feature of Byron, I think. This mixture of the high, the ideal, the sublime, the noble, with the degraded and the pathetic.
Byron had found sexual freedom in Europe, but he had also found his muse. Poetry had been an aristocratic hobby throughout his youth, but now he decided to write a poem inspired by his travels, a poem which would launch him into stardom overnight. In 1811, aged 23, Byron returned home to England, enriched by his grand tour of Europe. He was now a gentleman ready to enter London society.
The grand tour always has to end like every party. It's an extended party to that extent. It's the end of one's care for youth. I think the grand tour has always marked a kind of divide.
However, his homecoming was marked by tragedy almost immediately.
Byron learnt about his mother's death just after he got back from Greece. He was kind of racing to get up to Newstead before she died. He heard that she was gravely ill, and by the time he arrived, she was dead, and he was extremely cut up about that. He was found weeping over her coffin by one of the servants as he got all ready to go to the funeral, and then couldn't face it, and went in for a boxing bout with one of his servants, which was probably a way of letting out his feelings.
Byron had had a fraught relationship with his mother, but she had been his only close family. He was distraught. But yet again his fortunes were about to change. His poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which he had written whilst away, had just been published, and he was now in the cultural spotlight.
Childe Harold was an account of a young man who goes to Europe and his adventures there. And of course everyone immediately drew a parallel to Byron, who had done a similar sort of, well now I think the world's most legendary gap year. It was enormously popular.
Admire, exult, despise, laugh, weep, for here there is such matter for all feeling man.
As the title hero Childe Harold wandered broodingly through the romantic landscapes of Europe, he was quickly associated with Byron himself.
Byron wakes up one morning, he says, and he finds himself famous when Childe Harold is published, and it's supposed to be one of the most extraordinary publishing phenomena, that it just goes through multiple editions, Childe Harold, it sells out. He also finds himself adored overnight, adored by thousands of women who sort of throw themselves at him, write him letters, send him locks of hair, tell him in these letters how much they love his poetry, but also kind of imply all kinds of other affections. They find his impassioned, sincere, heartfelt verse very appealing and liberating.
Romance, gossip and titillation were part of the general milieu of 19th century aristocratic life. Byron was now a favourite at the most fashionable dances and banquets of the day.
Sex was everywhere. It was a commodity that was being bought and sold. Byron, of course, didn't need to buy or sell his sex. He got it on a platter from women who were reading his poetry, and he was meeting elite women who were not adverse to scandal. Because of Byron's pull for women, he managed to pull quite a few of them.
Byron's sexual allure drew him into a tangled web of affairs with the most elite women of his day. As women fought over him, one in particular attracted his attention.
Lady Caroline Lamb represented for Byron the most aristocratic young woman that he could possibly have met, and as such she enjoyed a kind of flagrant independence of behavior. Nothing could touch her. It was that status of being completely sure and secure about where she was and her privilege at the top of the heap, a security that Byron never achieved.
Caroline would have been an excellent choice socially if it had not been for the fact that she was married.
Caroline Lamb said about Byron, he was mad, bad and dangerous to know. But I think that also summed her up as well. Caroline was very much somebody who was of her own mind and wouldn't be controlled. She did exactly what she wanted when she wanted.
And she was in a certain sense fun to be with, and in a certain sense too, he could be wicked with her. Byron liked that because he was playing at wickedness. He's always playing at wickedness more than he's actually wicked, but she helped him to do that. Then he got bored with her, because I think in the end there's a certain shallowness about Lady Caroline Lamb.
As Byron's interest waned, Caroline became increasingly obsessive.
She famously cut herself in front of him, had a public burning of all of his letters to her. She did all of these things just to make her relationship with Byron as public as possible. She was the original kind of bunny boiler, this creepy thing of wanting to possess him completely.
Caroline became less and less discreet and reveled in the flagrant and the exhibitionistic, which I think ultimately she frightened him.
Because of his humble origins, Byron was incredibly insecure about his status and did not want a scandal to affect it.
It was a double-edged sword in the sense that he felt slightly trapped by his celebrity, certainly irritated by it, in the form of, you know, Caroline Lamb's shenanigans after they'd finished their affair. But it was necessary to the whole Byron phenomenon.
Although Byron was now a celebrated poet, he was heavily in debt. Newstead Abbey and a playboy lifestyle had drained his finances. He needed to find a rich wife, but any whiff of scandal would destroy his chance.
He wrote to one of his friends that he thought he would have to marry a golden dolly, in other words, a rich heiress.
Newstead Abbey is financially draining on him. Nevertheless, he didn't behave well in relation to Newstead. He didn't look after his tenants. He wasn't a shrewd estate manager. In a sense, he was more romantically attached to it than practically. He spent a lot of money on really good decorations so he could entertain people there, but he didn't repair the roof. So when it rained, all the decorations were ruined. He wasn't practical in that sense. And he's also poor because he refuses, at least on paper, to accept money for his poems because aristocrats, gentlemen, that would turn him into someone who gets his living by writing. And he hates that idea. He hates the idea that you could see ink on his fingers. He'd be a mere writer. He's not. He's a gentleman who writes.
Knowing full well that a scandal would affect his chances of finding an eligible bride, Byron compounded his problems by launching himself into an affair with another married woman.
Lady Oxford was a brilliant political hostess, an impassioned Whig, which we would call progressive liberal element of British politics, and she wanted to inspire Byron, alone among the women in his life, to make good on his promise of political activism.
Byron had already ventured into politics at the House of Lords when he made a speech supporting the rights of weavers because mechanisation had threatened their livelihoods.
Lady Oxford was extraordinarily brilliant and tried to be his political muse. She was not interested in leaving husbands, exploiting him sexually. She wanted to have a wonderful time with him, but also to turn him into the political figure that she felt he could and should be.
But Byron was not yet ready to explore a life in politics. He was concerned with finding a wife. Financial and emotional pressures were taking their toll, but his next love would embroil Byron in the biggest scandal of his life to date. By 1813, Byron had become the celebrity bad boy, worshipped as a poet, but frowned upon as a womanizer. He needed a rich wife to wipe out his debt. However, when he was reunited with his half-sister, Augusta, his chances of marriage became even more remote.
They encountered each other as young adults. Augusta Lee was already very unhappily married to another wastrel and gambler like their father.
She was tall and slim, had a receding chin, and also shared a lisp with Byron, so that might have been something that was attracted him. They shared good humour together, and she had a talent for mimicry, so she could actually make him laugh.
Augusta Lee was, in my view, the love of his life. She was the only one that he ever felt who understood him, that had that kind of maternal quality of all forgiving and unconditional love.
Although more dangerous than any of his past liaisons, it was a relationship that neither of them could control.
It was the threat of exposure about Byron's relationship with his half-sister that was the terrifying aspect to him.
The prospect of scandal was all the more worrying for Augusta. As woman of the bedchamber for the Queen, she was the main breadwinner for her children, and scandal could mean losing both them and her job. It was by now even more important that Byron should marry, and he sought out a more suitable bride, Annabella Milbank.
One of the attractions, I think, for Byron was with Annabella that she was slightly prim and she wasn't throwing her cap at him as all the other women were doing. In fact, it was Annabella who was responsible for the phrase Byromania. she wrote a little poem called The Byromania, which was about all these women throwing themselves at Byron. At the point when he felt that he needed to get out of his relationship with Augusta, with his half-sister, Augusta, in fact, encouraged him to think about marrying at that stage. He proposed again to Annabella, and she delightedly accepted.
And he did actually really think that perhaps marriage would settle him down and he could enjoy a better life. He'd had lots of affairs, he'd had his ups and downs, he'd had tantrums, he'd had the sobbing women on his doorstep, and it was perhaps time, he thought, that he would settle down and have a good life.
Annabella Milbank was probably the worst and unhappiest choice Byron could have made. She did not succeed in parting him emotionally or sexually from his sister. Rationally speaking, it was a sensible choice. She was an heiress. She was extraordinarily intelligent in terms of his views of wanting a companion. She was very clever. She turned Byron down several times. There's a proposal saying that she felt they were incompatible. Would that she had only kept to that. They could not have been more incompatible.
The marriage brought the promise of a future inheritance from his bride's family, but once Annabella had become accessible, he seemed to lose interest and was cruel to her from the start.
He seems to have treated her pretty badly during their honeymoon, been, ratty and cross. She certainly looked back on it as a pretty rough time. He called it the treacle moon instead of the honeymoon.
Byron heightened the tensions in the marriage by inviting his sister to live with them. He now played a cruel game, setting the two women off against each other and hinting about his love for his sister.
What went on in the first months of their marriage is a very murky situation, but it's clear that they did in fact live together, whether cohabitantly or not is hard to say, but emotionally the triad was a fraught situation. What brought the relationship and the terror of exposure to its denouement was that when Annabella produced their child, a daughter, the responsibility, the sense that he had entered into a separate and independent state of marriage, his indebtedness, he seems to have completely unhinged.
Byron, in the time when he was married, 1815 to 1816, I think was in the most wretched period of his life, where I think he drank a lot, he was worried by money, I think he was neurotic. I don't think he was technically manic-depressive, but he's closer to that kind of diagnosis at that period in his life than any other.
And he gambled and spent more on whores than he ever had done before, as his marriage was disintegrating and he was more and more miserable and simply was wheeling out of control. His whole emotional structure was falling apart.
After the birth of his daughter, Byron encouraged Annabella to leave London and stay with her parents. Initially, it was meant to be a brief separation, but safely away from Byron's clutches, Annabella confided her worries to her parents. Safely away from Byron's clutches, Annabella confided her worries to her parents.
Annabella and her family were so keen to see this relationship terminated with no blame accruing to her that they used the threat of exposure. It was not his relationship with Augusta per se that threatened to ruin him. And his father-in-law also held the trump of enlisting Caroline Lamb, the spurned woman who gave testimony that Byron had told her about his homosexual involvement.
With Caroline's involvement, Byron was in danger of having criminal charges laid against him. He had been rejected by his wife, and it was likely he would be rejected by the rest of elite society. Exile seemed the only escape from the situation, and once again he left the country. By 1816, aged 28, Byron's marriage was in tatters. He had lost both honour and family, and with allegations of incest and homosexuality, he was in danger of losing his life.
He had just separated from his wife under circumstances that were scandalised in society, incest being one rumour, homosexuality being the other, and God knows what else. A lot of things got spread about him, and Really, I think he sums it up very neatly. Either I was not fit for England or England wasn't fit for me, so I left.
Byron headed for Europe, seeking an escape from the scandals that surrounded him and the threat of legal action. He settled in Geneva, Switzerland.
Byron tried to portray his exile in Switzerland and his fleeing England in part as a political act. But once arriving in Switzerland, he saw himself, not altogether accurately, as a political exile, of which Switzerland then, as later in the 20th century, was full of political exiles.
Feeling humiliated and unjustly shunned by his aristocratic circles, Byron now tried to find solace in Switzerland's romantic landscape. The self-imposed prisoner struggled to come to terms with his present situation, hoping to escape his pain.
He tried to lose himself in the surrounding countryside, in all its glory and magnificence. And he couldn't. He couldn't do this. He couldn't lose his own wretched identity, is the word he uses.
Byron failed to overcome his torments in Geneva and remained apart from society. However, he found a creative ally in another exile, the poet Shelley.
Byron and Shelley were immediately attracted to each other, and their relationship was enormously fruitful. They found each other to be enormously inspirational, and they really kind of sparked off each other with ideas. And it seems to be a very intense relationship.
I think that they were very different. Shelley was an idealist and very radical in politics. Byron much more of a realist and a cynic.
Byron and Shelley's meeting was not coincidental. Prior to leaving London, Byron had begun an affair with a young woman, Claire Claremont, who was Shelley's sister-in-law.
Before they left England, Claire Claremont was pregnant with Byron's child. She was a young woman attached to the Shelley menage, a groupie, we might be inclined to describe her today, who simply had to be in the radiant circle of poets in the sense of being like the rock stars of the period.
Claire Claremont, in fact, was one of the women that she'd written to him as a fan, although there was a relationship through Shelley that he'd known her. He said he'd never loved Claire Claremont, but what he did say was, well, what do you do with a woman who's a 17-year-old who's prancing about at me at all hours? And the answer was to have an affair with her.
Claire had moved to Geneva with the Shelleys, and although Byron wanted to keep a low profile in Switzerland, it was not to be. Geneva was attracting many English visitors, and his celebrity meant that he was still in the public eye. The relationship between the Shelleys, Claire and Byron was now the subject of huge interest.
Numerous rumours were not only created but exploited, from people looking at the balcony across the lake. And the slightest bit of silk rippling on a line would be something scandalous going on.
Boatloads of people were taken on tours around the lake to have Byron and Shelley, these two wicked, terrible examples of humankind, where they were living in sin with their mistresses. And this fascinated Byron to some degree and annoyed him considerably. And eventually, I think that was one of the things that drove him from Geneva. He did not like to become a kind of a figure on the tourist map.
Byron began to hate Geneva and decided to move on, leaving the Shelleys and a pregnant Claire behind. Seeking anonymity, he moved to Italy and was immediately transformed by its hedonism.
Byron had always wanted to go to Venice. He called it one of the greenest islands of my imagination. He also later called it that old sea Sodom.
In Italy, he said that he'd had over 200 women. It was his opportunity to actually escape into experiencing his sexual passions to the full.
It was a grand, decaying, but still magnificent place. It was one of the places he lived actually for longest in his life. He lived there for pretty much 3 years.
When Byron gets to Venice, he is initially overwhelmed by the Italian way of life, and especially its freedom, its sexual freedom. And he did go to town there, and he boasted of it too, of the amount of women he got through. But initially, he really flings himself wholeheartedly into sensual existence. The carnival where people dressed up, the masking, where you could pretend to be somebody other than you really were.
Byron revelled in the freedom which Venice offered, feeling more at home than ever before. He began work on a new epic, Don Juan, and even started to accept payment for his poetry. As his life became more settled, he also found emotional stability with the 19-year-old Teresa Guiccioli.
He settles down a bit, so with Teresa Guiccioli, he was much more of a stable character, and they had, you know, a very long and kind of happy, well-ish, slightly up and down relationship, slightly less scandalous, although she was married, so he doesn't quite break that habit.
Although less scandalous, it was still a dangerous relationship, introducing Byron to a radical group of political dissidents.
Italy wasn't free. After all, it was ruled by the Austrians, so that Byron, in meeting Teresa Guiccioli, her family immediately seized on him as a great European figure and wanted to draw him into the cause to free Italy from the Austrians.
Byron's association with this cause would prove to be perilous, and was about to destroy the peaceful Venetian idyll. Byron's exile in Europe had seen him fluctuate between depression and excitement about his freedom away from the constraints of London. In Venice he had found love and rest in its liberated atmosphere. However, his relationship with Teresa had drawn him into a dangerous world of politics, and his idyll was about to be ruined.
They were forced to flee to Pisa because the Austrian police were on their trail, and the Austrian police regarded Byron with great suspicion, really. He was always suspected of being about to set off some enormous Italian revolution, which of course he never did, and by this time I think Byron had no particular wish to do this in Italy.
Instead, Byron was looking further afield to explore his political ambitions. In Pisa, he met up again with Shelley, whom he had left in Switzerland, and the reunited friends fired up each other's passions.
While they were living in Pisa, both Shelley and Byron separately commissioned boats. Byron's boat was quite a grand affair called the Bolivar, with several masts and cabins and so on. Shelley's boat was a much smaller, dinghy-like boat.
Although Byron had thrown himself into the boat-building enterprise, his life in Pisa was far from content. He had tired of his relationship with Teresa and was plagued by his ex-lover, Claire Claremont. After their separation, Claire had given birth to his daughter Allegra, but he had spitefully parted the girl from her mother.
Byron sent his little illegitimate, as he called poor Allegra, to a convent near Ravenna when she was just barely 4 years old, where she died. Horrible, horrible story. Her mother was not even allowed to visit her in the convent. Byron could be very vengeful, and particularly with women, when their pleas, demands frightened him, it brought out the most savage kind of recriminatory behavior. He would do anything to separate himself from an importunate woman.
Although he'd shown little interest in Allegra, Byron was horrified by her death. But it was not an end to the tragedy that now seemed to surround his days in Italy. Whilst testing his boat, Shelley had been caught in a storm off the Italian coast. His ship was wrecked and Shelley drowned, his body washed up on the beach.
Shelley's death was a sort of blow upon a bruise, and there was these very dramatic scenes where Shelley's body had to be burnt on the beach because the authorities wouldn't allow his body to be moved in the normal way because of hygiene reasons, and they had this almost pagan ceremony. The whole affair made Byron even more dissatisfied with his life in Italy, and probably led to his re-involvement with the Greek cause.
Shelley's death only strengthened Byron's desire to fight for a cause. In 1823, aged 34, Byron finally left Italy for Greece.
The great change, as far as Byron was concerned, in Greece, was that he was confronted with a Greece enslaved by Islam. The Greek cause kind of caught up with him. That he who'd sung the whole business of the need to set free Greece was approached himself to become one of the instruments of setting Greece free. And he couldn't turn it down. He wanted to become something other than a poet.
Byron also was wooed by the Greeks who were most active in the liberation from Turkish rule for money that by that time he had a great deal of. He had come into an inheritance and he was earning decent royalties, and he gave over an enormous part of his fortune, I think it was over £30,000 cumulatively, to the Greek cause for independence.
As soon as Byron arrived in Greece, he threw himself into the centre of the action, but he was not impressed by what he saw.
He found himself raising troops and trying to train this ragtag group of mercenaries, for the most part, in Missolonghi, the pestole of the universe. And at that point, it was swamp-ridden with malarial fevers in the rainy season.
Byron became increasingly fed up with the disorganization of the Greeks. He was also frustrated by the appalling weather which restricted him to the army barracks. Against local advice, he went out for a ride and caught a fever. After a few days, his condition seemed to worsen, and he died on the 19th of April, 1824, aged 36.
In its actuality, Byron's death was a non-heroic, miserable one, filled with disillusion and sorrow and regret. In the most horrible and primitive circumstances, he was really killed by the doctors who bled him to death.
Byron's death in many ways captures this contradiction which is a characteristic of his life and his work. He dies for a great cause, but in a very ignoble way. He doesn't die on the battlefield.
Although he didn't die fighting, his actions had a profound effect on the Greek cause.
Because he was such an enormously powerful international figure by this time, it made it possible for Greece to rise, to bring other people into the struggle. And he was, in fact, the kind of catalyst, I think, for the liberation of Greece, which would enormously have pleased him.
Byron had hoped to be buried on Greek soil, but his friends and family decided that his body should be brought home to England.
When he dies, there's a huge outburst of public sympathy for his death. When his funeral procession passes through London, lining the streets of London are hundreds of ordinary people weeping, really genuinely moved that he's died. He's a great champion of the ordinary reader, the ordinary man. He's perceived as their champion because he stood up for the rights of workers in the House of Lords, because he wrote a poetry which was deliciously irreverent of norms and conventions.
Whilst Byron's death was greeted with huge sympathy from the common people, he was still reviled by his noble contemporaries.
It was customary for the nobility to attend the funerals of one of their own, but in Byron's case, he was still in disgrace and they sent their carriages empty. It was a kind of empty, hollow gesture, a mark of propriety and yet a lack of sincerity.
Loved and hated in equal measure, Byron had proved to be mad, bad and dangerous to himself, but he'd become a legend as the ultimate romantic hero.